Go ahead. Whenever you're good, Brooke.
Okay. Hi everybody, and people will be watching this later. I'm Brooke, and today we're going to be talking about lay debate and just an introduction to lay debate across different events. A lot of this will be kind of centered on LD, just because I know more relating to traditional LD, but I'll also talk about different events like public forum, policy, and just kind of learning how to incorporate the style of lay debate regardless of what event it is that you do. So just for a little bit about me, I'm Brooke. Like I said, I'm a junior. I'm a co-president of WIN and very involved in speech and debate and different related efforts. I'm a really big fan of traditional LD. If you know me, that's kind of my forte. So this is definitely something that I'm excited to be talking about. I have a lot of experience when it comes to traditional LD. Where I'm from in Ohio, a lot of our local tournaments and state tournament are very lay and kind of focused on a more traditional style. So that's definitely given me a lot of useful background and experience when it comes to that. And then on a bigger level, I've qualified to NSDA Nationals 3 times and NCFL Nationals 3 times as well. Last year, I was a finalist at NCFL and placed 13th at NSDA Nationals. And I also do a lot of circuit debate here and there. So yeah, definitely something that I'm excited about and an area that I would say I definitely specialize in. So just to kind of go over or take a look at what we're going to go over more broadly, I'll start with just kind of an introduction and more of like just looking at the surface level idea of what lay debate is. And then we'll do a little more bit of a deep dive and then kind of go into the presentation aspect of it and the best way to present yourself when it comes to lay rounds. And then take a look at argumentation and just how you can kind of select different arguments strategically and, make sure that you're presenting the best things possible. Then we'll go into prep and kind of how to do the best prep when it comes to lay debate, and then more specifically in round strategy and just kind of a conclusion. I will say as a forewarning, the later slides are a lot less content heavy, and I'll just be talking about certain concepts more rather than going like point by point. But these first few will be a little bit more in depth because I think those are kind of the forefront of what lay debate is and kind of what that looks like. So starting with a bit of an introduction. So what is lay debate? I think a lot of people know what lay debate is or have some idea of what lay debate is or some misconception of what lay debate is. But just to put it very simply, lay debate, which is also commonly referred to as traditional debate, is just the style of debate that is usually judged by parents or debaters without, or not debaters, I guess, individuals without a debate background. So that kind of explains the lay part of it. It comes from the term something that's like a layman style. So I guess like learning how to communicate things to just the average person. So lay debates will usually be slower paced, more simple, rely more on stock arguments and commonly understood ideas, and definitely have a lot more of an emphasis on your speaking style, ability, persuasion, and rhetoric, which is really important when it comes to lay debate specifically. I think a lot of the time debaters will either like groan at having lay rounds or kind of misconceive it to be something that's really boring or too easy or just like something that's really like menial or tedious. But I think that over time and also with practice, lay debate can become really fun. It's definitely really rewarding and it does give you a lot of really great tangible skills that you can employ in debate, also out of debate. And I think regardless of whether or not you will end up primarily having lay rounds, I think a lot of the skills that come from lay debate, i.e. the more critical thinking aspects of things, learning how to just come up with things on your feet and really learning how to just like win people over are definitely really helpful in other styles of debate, like more technical debate, as well as in anything you do in your life. I think just for a little bit of a distinction, this isn't sort of the most important thing, but a lot of people do refer to lay debate and traditional debate as kind of one of the same. From my experience, I would say they're not always necessarily the exact same thing. I think that most traditional rounds end up being lay rounds, but there are often traditional debate rounds which are just more like I would say maybe flow heavy or things that don't necessarily rely on all of this same aspects that lay debate does, like how slow you speak and things that more experienced coaches, individuals, etc. In Ohio, there are definitely a lot of lay rounds, but we'll also have more traditional rounds that aren't necessarily lay rounds. So coaches or adults or individuals who have a good understanding of debate, but still prefer the more traditional style with more stock arguments and things like that. So I think that's just good to keep in mind, but not really the biggest distinction. And I'll probably end up using them pretty interchangeably throughout the presentation. So I did this just for a little bit of a comparative. I think a lot of people know this, but if you're a beginner or you're newer to debate, it can be a little confusing to understand each thing and what kind of marks each different style of debate and what you should be prepared for when people kind of say these debates, or like what you should be competing at tournaments, or just to understand what people are referring to when they talk about these things. So like I just said, lay debate, you can usually tell what is a lay round and like what lay debate is when debates are usually slower or more moderate speed. As well as the different arguments that are run. So they'll typically be commonly run arguments or ones that are really easily understood and digestible, or the ones that are just sort of the most mainstream on that topic, i.e. the stock arguments. So if you think of the UNCLOS or ICC topic that LD just debated, let's say like the mining advantage, that was definitely something that was really common and a lot of people understood. Or on the wealth tax topic before that, the econ disadvantage. So just really looking at the things that people really understand and the areas of controversy within a topic that everybody can kind of get something from and grasp onto without any like confusion about what that is talking about or what it's referring to. So I would say that definitely shows up a lot more in lay debate because it spares you the time of having to really get into a deep dive of explaining like some niche area of a topic or some specific article of UNCLOS rather than just focusing on the things that make the most sense and the things that are most reflected in the literature, which usually ends up being the arguments that are the most true on the topic. Additionally, I think lay rounds are usually found at local and state tournaments. So like I said, here in Ohio, most of the tournaments I compete at are very lay. Almost all of the rounds I have are lay rounds or traditional rounds. So I would say generally the trend is that you'll usually end up doing a lot more of these kinds of debates on local or state tournaments. That obviously varies depending on your district or the state that you're from. Some are a lot more technical, some are a lot less technical. So you never really know, but I will say that I think they're definitely less frequently found at national levels, or if you do go to national tournaments frequently, you'll probably be having a lot less lay rounds than you will other styles. So I guess just also digging a little bit into different kinds of styles of debate. This definitely depends based on like the event that you do. A lot of what I say again like might refer back to LD things, but I think this is also applicable regardless of the event. So there are definitely different more kinds of technical or progressive styles of debate. You'll find that in LD, policy, also nowadays in PF, which has definitely become more of a trend in recent years. A lot of people are taking to national circuit debate and focusing more on different kind of technical styles of debate. I would say aside from that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there are definitely forms of debate that are sort of a middle ground. So more traditional forms of debate that aren't necessarily lay rounds or flow debate or like flay debate, some people refer to it as, which is, I would say, probably the most common in PF. So just kind of having those rounds where you're still having a really good substantive round, but it's not necessarily a lay round. And then obviously different other kinds of technical debate, depending on what you do, what you're interested in, specific argument bases, and things like that. A lot of these other styles, again, will be either more fast-paced or moderate speed, depending on what you're doing. Things like spreading, which you won't really see show up ever in lay rounds or most of the time. I would say pretty much never should be in your lay rounds, and are usually more complex or in-depth or more technical arguments and things that you discuss in that round compared to what you'd be discussing in a lay round. Also, just another comment in terms of like tournaments and where you'll be sort of finding these kinds of styles of debate. I would say these are definitely a lot more frequently at national circuit tournaments, but like I said, you may be from a state or district or circuit where your style of debate or your form of debate that you engage in is a lot more technical, regardless of where you come from, or I guess just specific to where you come from. So just to dig a little bit deeper into that, I think this is also good information to have if you anticipate doing a lot of lay debate, or just if you're new to the activity and don't necessarily know where you should expect these kinds of debates, or if you're a super experienced, well-vetted debater and you're just like tired of having those like lay rounds just thrown at you like in the middle of nowhere at a national tournament. I think it's definitely important to always be prepared or anticipate having a lay round. I guess that also depends on where you end up competing, but it's good to just anticipate that you may end up having a parent judge. I think that there are often a couple parent judges in the pool, regardless where you're at. Or if you know that you're attending tournaments where there typically are more lay judges or parent judges, it's just good to be prepared for that and understand what you should expect from those judges, and understand kind of what you're getting yourself into. So like I said, a lot of lay rounds are typically on a local or state level. So again, it definitely depends on where you're from, but that's usually where they're concentrated. And then you'll definitely have some lay rounds at national tournaments. I personally enjoy lay debate a lot, so I'll end up like wanting more lay rounds than less, but other debaters really don't like lay rounds or definitely don't want to have them or try to avoid them at national tournaments. But I would say they definitely do come up. And depending on what you're competing at, there could be national tournaments where there are no lay judges in the pool. There could be tournaments where there are a few lay judges in the pool, or there could be tournaments where lay judges are half the pool. So you don't always know what you're getting into. It's definitely important to do your research before you go to tournaments, make sure you're reading paradigms, things like that. And these trends also definitely vary depending on the event you do. I would say that a lot of those things that I just mentioned are definitely from my understanding of different tournaments in LD. But for example, if you do PF, there are more often lay rounds at national circuit tournaments than if you do LD and you go to national circuit tournaments, just because of the style, like comparatively the different styles of each event. The same probably applies to policy. You'll have a lot more technical rounds than lay rounds. So definitely just think about it in the context of the event that you do specifically and what you know to be true. But I would say it's definitely just important to keep that in mind and know what you're getting into when you go to a tournament. I think regardless, I always like to have lay cases ready. I always like to just be ready to explain things and just have the prep necessary in case I do end up having lay rounds, because that's definitely a better position to be in than getting surprised by a lay round and not knowing what to do, or not knowing how to simplify your prep or present yourself in a certain way to win over your judges. Also, just like a little mention, the kind of like culmination of lay debate tournaments, or like the big national championship ones, are the NSDA National Tournament, and then NCFL Nationals. So those are kind of like the peak of traditional / lay debate. So if you're ever wondering, I guess, what to expect if you do end up qualifying or going into these tournaments, those are typically lay tournaments. It definitely depends on, of course, the year, judge pool, etc. But these are usually the ones that people will be attending for high levels of competition for traditional debate, compared to something like the TOC, which is obviously the culmination of sort of national circuit debate and those tournaments. Okay, so getting a little bit more into the presentation aspect of things, which I think is probably the biggest thing that lay debate is focused on. And I would say, like, if you want to learn lay debate, I think the most important thing is learning the presentation aspect of it, and everything else will kind of just follow suit, especially if you're somebody who's already experienced in debate. You already have the foundational skills necessary to do well in debate, or to learn how to debate itself. I think that it just really comes down to simplifying and refining your skills. If you're newer to debate or newer to the activity in general, or just don't have a lot of competitive background, I still think it's a really great place to start, to just learn how to present your ideas effectively and convey those ideas effectively, regardless of whether or not you end up wanting to do a lot of lay debate or end up actually doing a lot of lay debate in the long run. So just to break it down, I think kind of the primary areas of lay debate or skills that I think are useful when it comes to lay debate, or just things that I've noticed kind of are the primary things that you should be focusing on or thinking about. The first one is definitely confidence. I think you'll hear people say this a lot in relation to lay debate. There are also a lot of misconceptions about what that looks like. If you're a more introverted person, that doesn't mean that you have to be really loud or really aggressive, or vice versa. If you're a really aggressive person, that doesn't mean that you have to really tone it down a whole lot. Just more so about how you carry yourself. I think another big thing is definitely respect. So again, this doesn't necessarily mean being superficial or overly polite and things like that, but just making sure that there's a certain level of respect that you're meeting while you're debating, and just making sure that you're maintaining that throughout the round. Also, especially when you're interacting with your judges, I think that matters a lot more than it will in any other kind of debate, because lay judges are not really people who are there just for, I guess, debate or the same reasons that you are, i.e. they may not be a coach, they may not really have the same understanding of the topic, or they may not be there for, the same competitive advantage that obviously you as a debater are there for. So just keeping in mind that they're people and they're there to contribute to your educational experience, usually to support their kids, for parent judges, things like that, and just making sure that you're approaching that with respect as well. And then I think that also ties in nicely to another big idea. So just your ability to connect with others. That doesn't mean just your judges, but also means your opponents. So are you really sort of establishing the connections necessary to convince your judges, but at the same time, are you speaking with and interacting with your opponent in a way that makes your judge see that you're somebody who's a respectful and effective communicator, rather than being somebody who's either really rude or tramples all over their opponent, doesn't let anybody else talk, all things that will diminish your credibility and ultimately make your judge less likely to kind of want to vote for you or hold your arguments as something that's credible, regardless of whether or not they like you or they don't like you. I think on a purely argumentative level, it's also important that you're just making sure that you're interacting with the people in the round well. And then finally, I think persuasion is definitely a really big thing. That's a vague term, but definitely just means focusing on the way that you communicate and whether or not that you're doing that in a convincing and effective and persuasive manner, which we'll get into each of these individually. So I think honing in on confidence, this is always what I like to start with because I kind of had a misconception of what this looked like myself when I started getting into debate in general, but also more specifically when I started competing more frequently in like primarily lay rounds. So just really learning what that means, what that looks like, and how to build the confidence that can help you do well and succeed when it comes to lay debate. So I think just in general, just knowing that you are somebody who's there and believes what they're saying, or not necessarily believes what they're saying, but at least appears to be sure of what they're saying, and also appears to be somebody who's well prepared and just ready to kind of answer anything and make sure that they're presenting themselves well is really important. And I think that the biggest thing as to why confidence matters itself is just that you want to make sure your judges feel assured that they're voting for the debater and the side that is, like I just said, somebody who's really well prepared, knowledgeable, assertive, but also very level-headed and can carry themselves well, and ultimately is the most convincing in the room. So, as a person who may not have a very deep debate background, if I'm watching two people discuss a current event or issue or political topic or policy or something like that, I will likely be most persuaded by the person who's able to kind of interact with others well and able to carry themselves in a way that makes me know, like, hey, this person knows what they're talking about, or hey, this person's definitely really knowledgeable about the area that they're talking about, which makes them more likely to trust you and make them more likely to believe that you know a lot about the specific economic policy that you're talking about if you're speaking about it in a way that shows that you really understand the background knowledge and information, you know the specific terms relating to it, things like that. So that's obviously just like a small example, but just making sure that you know what you're talking about and making sure that it comes off to your judge as like you being somebody who is an expert or knowledgeable, or at least appears to be confident in their ability to debate and win over the rest of the people in the room, regardless of what they're discussing, is definitely super important. So it's always good to just remember in the back of your head, if you look like you know what you're talking about, your judges will likely believe that you do, and they don't really have a way to sit there and sort of back check every single thing you say and think like, well, are they right about this or are they right about this? And I think that while a lot of people who don't have kind of like the same knowledge about a topic as you do, those people are less likely to be really skeptical and like critical and pick apart every single thing you're saying. So it's really important that you, as the debater, are focusing a lot on that big picture idea and making sure that you really look like you know what you're talking about. Even if you may not know every single aspect of everything, your judges likely don't either. So if you can't answer every single like little nitty-gritty detail that your opponent might be able to, or if you're putting forth a more simple, holistic argument where your opponent might be debating something more, I guess, again, like detail oriented, those are things that I wouldn't really worry about. I would just focus more on bolstering your overall image in the round and also just making sure that whatever arguments you're rating are being conveyed in a way that makes sense and also shows that you're confident about the work that you've done and the way that you carry yourself in the round. So that's definitely super important. I know that it can be hard to really understand what it means to appear confident or kind of exude that confidence. But I think when you think about it just practically, you want to make sure that you look like you know what you're talking about. And I think a good little slogan also, if this helps you, is just fake it till you make it. But the reason that I always tell people to be really cautious about that one is because I'm not saying that you should lie. I think some people are like, oh, lay debate, you can get away with anything. Like the judge isn't going to check, like the judge isn't going to care. They don't know anything about the topic. So I can just stand up and lie about my evidence, or I can just stand up and paraphrase things, or I can just stand up and say that this evidence said this when it really didn't. Definitely should not be doing those things. I think that it's okay to speak about things authoritatively. It's really important that you appear to be knowing what you're talking about and make sure that you are conveying things effectively, but do make sure that you're not using that as a reason to just lie about anything because you know nobody's going to check it. I think that hurts you a lot more than it helps you. And it's really important that while lay debate often tends to be a lot less technical and a lot less complex, that you're still doing the work yourself to be technically sound and factually correct instead of only focusing on the rhetorical aspect of things or only focusing on the image and sort of narrative of things. Make sure that you're kind of balancing both pieces and having a good image, having good rhetoric, sounding like somebody that your judge does really want to vote for and is a really great communicator. But at the same time, don't use all of those things as a reason to just either state false information or misconstrue things or say things that you don't know are correct just to say it because you think it sounds right or you think the judge isn't going to check. So it's definitely a fine line to walk. Just make sure that you're not going too much one way or the other. Don't lie at all. I really, really, really hope that nobody sits here and is like, oh, well, you can just do whatever you want and lie. Because definitely one of my biggest pet peeves. I think that it's really important to make sure that you're being honest about what you're talking about, what you're debating about. And it'll be a lot worse for you if your judge somehow does catch on to the fact that you're making things up than if you just tell the truth to begin with and make sure that you're accurately conveying your arguments and positions on the topic. Aside from that, I think it's just important that you're presenting your arguments and ideas in a way that sounds like you're sure of things. I kind of already talked about this a little bit, but I just want to kind of build off of that point before. While you shouldn't make things up, obviously, it's okay to not be 100% sure about everything. I think that naturally you can't get every single little thing right about a topic, or you can't cover every single piece of ground, but it's really important that even when you're not 100% sure that XYZ is correct, or even when you're not 100% sure that your argument is better than your opponent's when you're comparing something, it's really important that the way that you present it does still come across as if you are sure and as if you are at least somewhat like confident in the fact that your argument is correct. Otherwise, if you're presenting arguments in a way where you're really questioning what you're saying, or your opponent sort of pokes a certain hole in your argument and you don't take the time to go back and really fix that and clarify that because you're worried that your opponent is right, that's probably the worst thing that you can do to yourself when it comes to just like communicating your arguments effectively. I think that a trap that a lot of debaters might fall into, especially if you're somebody who's newer to the activity, is just thinking like, oh, my opponent had a really great response. Like, they're definitely right. Like, what do I do? And I think obviously, again, you shouldn't make things up to combat that, but it is really important that you're able to navigate your opponent's responses, even when they are really true, or even when they are probably correct, and making sure that you're doing that comparative work and just showing your judge why your side is still better or why your argument is still correct, and just knowing kind of how to work around those things and still present yourself in a way that's super convincing, super nice to your judge, even when you're not 100% sure, or even when you don't know that everything you're saying is a lot better than your opponent or something like that. That kind of covers the main things. I think the last thing to quickly touch on, which will tie a little bit into some things that we'll talk about later as well, is the concept of perceptual dominance. So we did kind of talk about this a little bit when it comes to just like being assertive and making sure that you're somebody who looks like you have control over the round. But I think the term perceptual dominance more specifically is something that's really important to consider when it comes to just like looking like you're ahead in the round and looking like you really have a grasp on things and are somebody who's in control of the debate, or you're the one who's kind of pushing the debate in a certain direction or the other. Because if your judge sees that you're the one who's really on top of things and in control of the narrative, then you're a lot more likely to convince them that what you're doing and the arguments that you're conveying and the way that you're talking about things is the side that's correct compared to your opponent if your opponent is doing a lot less of that, or if your opponent is not really putting the emphasis on trying to appear like they're sort of the one in charge of the round. So again, this is definitely one of those things where there's a fine line for that. Make sure that you're not really trampling over other people, not letting them speak, thinking that you're being assertive, but it's just ending up being rude. You definitely don't want to cross into those things. Again, those are things that will hurt you a lot more than they will help you, but it's definitely important that you're still maintaining the same assertiveness, etc., and not really worrying about, I guess, like it's important to keep those things in mind, but that doesn't necessarily need to be your main focus throughout the debate. Just make sure that you're debating honestly and authentically, but definitely consider the way that you're coming across in the round and making sure that you're looking like you're the one on top of things throughout most of it. If anybody has any questions, by the way, you can definitely put it in the Zoom chat. And I'll go back and answer a lot of things as well. But that was definitely one of the lengthier areas. And some of the things we talk about will be less in depth than that. But a lot of these things are very closely related ideas. So we'll definitely talk about a lot of things all at once. Okay, a really quick question. I think that's a really good question. And I think we'll get a little bit into that also later in the lecture as well. But the question was, how do you effectively stop people from talking too much during cross-ex? And I think that that's definitely an acquired skill. It takes practice, but I think that the best way that you can go about cutting people off, or I guess depending on the situation, if somebody's answering a question in a really lengthy manner, or maybe asking questions in a really lengthy manner, is just, I guess, politely restating what you're trying to say, without making it seem like you're telling your opponent, like, stop talking, whatever. I think just making sure that you're reiterating your question, or if you ask a question, your opponent is just rambling, just saying politely, like, something like, hey, like, that's not the question I asked, or would you answer this specific question instead, or something like that. And just making sure that, again, you're being polite, but still making it clear to the judge that your opponent is going on and on about something you didn't ask, or that your opponent is giving a really lengthy answer to something that's really simple. So again, it definitely depends situation to situation. That's also something that you kind of will be able to pick up more naturally as you go about doing different kinds of rounds more often. But I think that it's not something that you should worry too much about, because oftentimes, if your opponent is being really, really lengthy, or cutting you off in cross, or taking up a lot of your cross time, judges will catch on to that very quickly. I think lay judges especially really don't like it when somebody's taking up all of the cross. So like I said, also that goes back to that idea of perceptual dominance. You want to make sure that you are in charge, but not so much that you're taking up all of that time. So I think that there are ways that you can go about obviously shutting it down politely, but also you shouldn't be too worried, or don't despair too much about that, because I think your judges often really sympathize with that and see what's happening, and are more likely to let that hurt your opponent's credibility than yours. So I've gotten bouts before where I'll ask too many questions, or I'll explain things like more in depth when I'm asking questions, and judges will say something like, like, use less of your cross time to explain things, or let your opponent have more time to answer. Or they'll tell their opponents, like, or they'll tell opponents that I've had, like, give less lengthy answers, or like, don't talk too much about this and this, and give your opponent some time to answer. So I think that's actually something that lay judges are very perceptive about. And that's definitely a great question. And we'll talk a little bit more about cross-ex as well. I hope that answers it. Again, like, if anybody else has any questions, feel free to just throw it in there and we'll talk about it. So getting into a little bit of the next thing, this does definitely tie a lot into confidence. So I'll probably not spend too much time going really in depth about this, but I think just being respectful is really important when it comes to lay debate. And I think that it's definitely a big part of how you present yourself. And while it's something that, again, isn't necessarily a debate skill, it's still a really valuable skill that will affect the way you debate when it comes to lay rounds. So if you're somebody who doesn't love lay rounds, or you're somebody who doesn't necessarily love, I guess, like, the different things that you need to learn how to be able to do lay round, this can feel more tedious, or feel a little superficial, or like, why am I wasting time trying to learn how to be nice to people? But it definitely is a lot deeper than that. And I think a valuable skill, regardless of what debate you hope to specialize in, or regardless of whether or not you plan on doing a lot of different lay rounds, things like that. So I think naturally debate is obviously a competitive activity. So it's definitely an activity or an area in which you'll find a lot more people who are just naturally a little meaner, or maybe cockier, or maybe just leaning more towards that than you would find really nice, or really calm, polite, etc. kind of people. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So definitely no shade if your style of debate is more aggressive, or maybe more mean in its nature. But it's definitely something that you should just be wary of in lay rounds. So again, that doesn't mean that you have to become the world's nicest debater. I know a lot of really great debaters who may seem a little more cocky, or a little meaner, or a little more assertive, because that's just the style kind of that they prefer, or that's what they're most comfortable doing, or maybe that's just the way they are and the way that they talk with people. That's not necessarily wrong. So some people do have that kind of style. And if that works for you, and you know that works for you, you should definitely stick to it and not really worry about trying to debate in a way that you're not. Again, I think that goes back to the idea of just debating authentically, and making sure that you're being authentic in the way that you communicate, and not necessarily worrying about too much about how people are perceiving you. although lay debate is really heavy on making sure people perceive you in a certain way, make sure, again, that you're not sacrificing how you are fully just to be perceived differently by lay judges. So I think it's really important just to keep this in the back of your head that if you find yourself being just more flat out rude, impolite, or unkind, rather than somebody who might just be a little naturally more assertive, etc., or the kind of debater that we were talking about previous to this, you just want to make sure that, again, that you're not really crossing that line. I think a lot of lay debate is really easy to think of it like that. Like there are two different sides of things, and a lot of the time, lay debate just goes right down the middle. I think that if you're, again, somebody with a certain kind of style, you shouldn't worry too much about compromising it, but just be careful that it's not leaning in towards something that's just blatantly unkind or mean or not helpful to the people in the room. I think the reason why this is important because again, a lot of people are skeptical about this being something that they should care about or don't really want to kind of focus on this or learning how to make sure that you are navigating rounds with respect. But just to give you, I guess, some justifications as to why I think that's important, or from what I've learned in my experience with lay debate, I think the first thing is that lay judges tend to implicitly lean towards the more, I guess, friendly, nicer of the two debaters, or somebody that they feel more comfortable kind of placing their confidence behind. So if you think of politicians, for example, well, this isn't true, I guess, in every single context. And again, these things definitely vary person to person. If you're like just an average person or just the general public, you'll tend to find somebody or a politician or a public speaker who's, I guess, speaking in a way that's more polite, respectful, mannerisms that are respectful to everybody. You'll find that more appealing, I guess, naturally than you would somebody who stands up and screams or somebody who stands up and says a lot of unkind things. So again, while those things aren't true in every context, I think just to the general public, when you're speaking in a way that makes people feel comfortable, makes people feel valued, you're being friendly with others in the room, it just makes everybody's lives a lot easier and also will kind of give you a little bit of an edge and make your judges, especially lay judges, just kind of implicitly feel more comfortable voting for you or focusing on your arguments or believing what you're saying, and it'll kind of bolster your credibility in that sense. The second thing that I think is important is that a lot of lay judges flat out will not vote for people who are mean or impolite. And while this is definitely a lot rarer than the first situation, which is just that they prefer people to be nicer, more respectful, etc., there are some judges who just like genuinely will not want to vote for somebody who's being unkind in the round or conducting themselves in a way that's not really kind or, respectful to everybody in the room, and just don't really feel comfortable voting for that or will vote against you for it. I've seen people have ballots that will literally be like, I didn't like the way you talked to your opponent, or I didn't like the way you talked to me, or you were screaming the whole round. It wasn't productive. I'm not voting for you. So that's unfortunate. I hope that none of you end up in that situation, but it's just definitely something to keep in mind. I would assume that not many people are so extreme in that way that judges will list that as their only reason for decision. And on the other side of things, not all judges are that way, where again, that will be the only thing that decides their ballot. But it's definitely something just to keep in mind and make sure that you're not ever putting yourself in the situation where judges may genuinely just be like, I didn't like the way you talked, or I didn't like the way you interacted with others. Don't do that. I'm not voting for you. So I think that's why it's important. And then just aside from that, it's just good to connect with your judge in a way that they feel comfortable just with you in the round, and also just feel like you're a person who's speaking to them, and not somebody who's being unnecessarily like rude, aggressive, etc. Because while it's an activity with a lot of value to the debaters, to lay judges, or to people who are not heavily involved in the activity, it may not bear the same value, or it may not necessarily, I guess, mean the same things that it does to us as the debaters. So it's just definitely important to keep that in mind, that a lot of the time these people are just people volunteering their time and trying to help you and contribute to the activity, but might not necessarily be so entrenched in it in the way that we are sometimes, or in the way that a lot of debaters might be. So just keep that in mind. Keep in mind that they're human. They're just people who are there to learn something, and people who you're there to teach something new. And you're also there to learn from them. So just making the time to talk to them, diffuse the tension, and make sure that you're just not like, make sure that you're creating an environment where everybody feels comfortable engaging in the round. Aside from that, I think just generally being level-headed, being polite, while still maintaining a lot of the things that we talked about when it comes to being confident is definitely super helpful, and just maintaining a basic level of respect, not just for your judges, but also for your opponents. any behaviors or tendencies that you know you may have in rounds that are, let's say, not the nicest or things that are not the most pleasant. Try to leave those at the door when it comes to lay rounds because if anything, they will likely hurt you more than they will help you. And I think it's good in general to just do your best to be nice and contribute to making the activities something that people feel comfortable in. Okay. Kind of building off of that, I'll again probably not spend too much time getting into this, but when it comes to just building connections with people, like we just talked about a little bit at the end there, it's definitely really good to just make sure that you're connecting with the people in the room. So whether that's your judges, just making small talk, things like that. I think nonverbal cues are also definitely important. So just making sure that you're smiling, you know, you look like you're happy to be there, things like that, making eye contact with your judges, just little different things that sort of solidify your credibility or bolster your image towards the judge can definitely be helpful. These things aren't vital and not things that you should really stress yourself over, but it's good to just be aware of how you're coming off to people or coming across to people and just being aware to take the time to connect with people in the room. So with your opponents, judges, etc., your judges are definitely observant people. They can see how you're carrying yourself, and a lot of the time that will speak more to them than the arguments that you're saying or the speeches that you're giving. So just being aware of that and making sure that you're kind of focusing on that as well. Again, this is a similar concept, but I think just going back to the idea that your judges are just people and so are you, it's definitely important that when you go into lay rounds that you snap yourself out of like the debater mindset or the debater persona or maybe a specific debate tone that you may have. I think that it's pretty stereotypical like of debaters to speak in a certain way or interact in a certain way, but there are a lot of little things or mannerisms that you may not be aware of that are not necessarily commonly understood by everybody or things that not every parent judge will sort of I guess enjoy like watching or things that every parent judge will understand even. So just checking yourself when you go into lay rounds and thinking like, okay, I'm here to talk about XYZ topic. I'm here to make it clear and simple, and I'm here to educate the judge about something that they may not be aware about. Something that I learned, just sort of like an analogy, which has definitely been something that I've kept in mind throughout my debate career, that I learned from at camp like a couple summers ago, was just think of lay debate as something where you're both fellow like scholars or really smart individuals. That definitely sounds silly, but it does help a lot. So if you think of yourself as both people with expertise just in different areas, for example, you as the debater are the expert in debate, or maybe the expert in that topic area. Your judge may not be an expert in debate or may not be an expert in that topic area, but they are an expert in some other way. So whether that's an expert at being a parent or an expert at whatever profession they do, or some people who will have a really specific background. So maybe you get really lucky and on the UNCLOS ICC topic, you have a parent judge who's an international lawyer or something like that. Just keeping in mind that everybody has their own strengths, skill sets, areas of knowledge, and making sure that you're bringing together, like you're bringing your ideas to the table in a way that is like you're just sharing some new information with them that they may not have. And you're there to kind of let them in on an area of expertise that they may not be the expert in themselves is definitely super important. But you just want to make sure that you're never crossing into the area where you're making your judges feel dumb or you're making your judges feel like they don't know what they're like there for or they don't really know what you're talking about. So just avoid being condescending or dipping towards like any sort of mannerisms that may make your judge feel like they're not like a quality judge just because they may not have the same experience. So that's definitely important. Just definitely helpful to keep in mind when you go into rounds. Again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to just stop me whenever. Just gonna take a sip of water, but this is the last thing that we'll talk about when it comes to just purely presentation. So this is definitely a big overarching theme, but just persuasion is something that you should just keep in mind in lay rounds. I think when I think of lay rounds, I either think of the things that we just talked about, but most frequently people think of being persuasive and how do you ensure that you're being a persuasive debater or a persuasive speaker, or just winning over your judge in a way that will help you win rounds and help you communicate things effectively. So I think persuasion, just a good way to think about what the word means itself. I think a lot of people know what it means, but it's hard to kind of focus on how you're supposed to be doing that and how you're supposed to be building up a more persuasive nature or making your arguments more persuasive. I think it's just easy to think of it as being really compelling and clear and communicating in a way that you can just win other people over, or in a way that they feel confident placing their vote behind your argument or placing their support behind you. So this can show up in a lot of different ways, and there are a lot of different things that you can do to bolster this and to make your persuasion more effective. But I just kind of put down some main things that I think have helped me a lot. The first one being speaking slowly and just articulating your words and sentences really clearly. I'm somebody who's naturally a pretty fast speaker. I'm also, I would say, a little more soft-spoken at times. So, or at least in spaces like debate or public speaking, things like that. It definitely took some time for me to just adapt a certain style in which I'm still able to communicate slowly and clearly, and still like loud and understandable and in a way that like is convincing in that sense. So, if you're somebody who may be, again, more introverted or of a quiet nature, like I wouldn't freak out here and worry about how you're able to sort of build that up like unnaturally. It's really important, again, that you're being authentic when you do lay debate and debating in a way that's most comfortable to you. But there are definitely little things that you should try and adapt to and little things that you should try and build up that can really help you, regardless of what your style is like right now, or regardless of the kind of speaker that you're like right now. So while I would say I'm a really fast speaker most of the time, lay debate has definitely helped me to learn how to just slow it down, use less words, make sure I'm not being really complex or technical, or make sure that people can follow what I'm saying. And I think that that's just a really valuable skill in debate, out of debate as well, and then in other forms of debate too. If you've really just learned how to break down your arguments and break down your ideas to what they are at their core, and rather than just concentrating on like the level or like surface level or something that not everybody may understand, it's definitely just really valuable to be able to build up those skills yourself. So something that's really important for that is make sure you're not really using heavily complex language, especially when it comes to debate jargon. If you are using terms that you know your judges are not going to be familiar with, it's really important that you explain those terms and just explain what you're doing. Things like signposting can also be really helpful here. So telling your judge before you start a speech, like I'm going to start on the affirmative case and then go to the negative case, and then compare both sides. And then when you're giving your speech, just giving really clear cues saying like, let's take a look at the affirmative case, and then let's take a look at the negative case. Just making sure that people can follow you really clearly. It's definitely really helpful and helps you a lot when it comes to being persuasive. And then just going back to that idea of explaining the terms that you're using. If you are planning on weighing two different impacts and you want to say that you or your arguments outweigh on time frame, while those are words that we may know as debaters and words that your judges probably do know, they might not know what all of those words mean thrown together or in that context. So when I'm doing weighing, like to break it down or say really simplistically, like, let's compare both arguments, or let's do a comparative analysis of both arguments. We would say that our argument about XYZ is more likely to occur more quickly than my opponent's. Here's why this matters. So doing something like that, where you're really just breaking it down to like what it means itself, rather than just saying things and kind of spewing jargon, is really helpful for you as a debater to, again, make it really clear why you're winning and what you're winning. But also really important when it comes to lay rounds, because your judge probably has no idea what you mean when you say I outweigh on time frame or I outweigh on magnitude or something like that. And even if it's intuitive enough that they can probably figure it out, don't make them do the work for you, and kind of create the clearest path to the ballot yourself, and make sure that you're making yourself as persuasive as you can be to begin with, instead of making them fill in those gaps for you. The last thing that's important here is just intonation and like your speaking style. So I kind of talked about this a little bit, but the way that I learned how to effectively do lay debate was just learning to speak like a politician. With how charged politics can be lately, this may not sound like the best things, but it just really means at its core, learning to speak like somebody who's trying to win over the general public on specific issues that, again, the public may not be super knowledgeable about some specific economic policy. But your job as a politician would hypothetically be to break down the economic policy and make it digestible in a way that A, the public understands it, and B, the public is convinced that your position on that policy is the correct position, and then they'll vote for you, or something like that. So just really thinking about ways where you can communicate to people in a way that not just like resonates with people, but also sounds like really assured, reliable, understandable, and passionate about what you're talking about, and kind of bringing that energetic, enthusiastic aspect to things while still making sure that the content you're delivering makes sense, and you're really like knowledgeable knowledgeable about what you're doing and level-headed in that way. So if you think about like previous presidential debates or one of Barack Obama's DNC speeches went really viral, or maybe viral is not the right word, but was definitely a big hit, I think in 2008. People really liked the way he spoke to his voters, things like that. So regardless of like different political opinions, a lot of people can recognize like the way that politicians speak being something that's valuable and persuasive. So sometimes just thinking of things like that yourself and thinking like, how can I be somebody who's speaking like a leader, somebody who's really knowledgeable what I'm doing, and really diplomatic, things like that, are really helpful and really a good way to envision or just kind of think about what it means to be a persuasive speaker or be a good debater. Something else that you can also think about is just when it comes to persuasive speaking, is something like a TED Talk. So when you're reading, this is going to be less applicable for things like your rebuttal speeches, but when you're reading like the constructive part of your case, or I mean, of the round, like your case, it can be really helpful to think like, I'm giving a presentation on something, or I'm sharing XYZ area of information with somebody in the same way that a TED Talk does. So they'll really break it down, they'll make it slow and digestible, they'll speak to you like they're super excited about what they're talking about, but also make sure that they're conveying things that are important, things like that. So just really thinking about the way you're talking to people in the round and the way you're engaging people in the round. You just want to win your judges over and be leveraging your speaking style, the arguments that you read, tone, responses that you do, or the responses that you make to make sure that you're aligning with those things. So kind of getting into the next part of things is we're going to talk a little bit more about argumentation. I'll just be talking about a lot of these, not necessarily looking at specific like point by point things. So feel free to throw out any questions if you have any area that you want me to focus more specifically on when it comes to this. But we'll just really break down what it means to have solid like argumentation when it comes to your lay rounds. So in terms of that, more broadly, I would say that something important to know about lay debate is that it's typically less complex and prioritizes just argumentation that's more digestible and simplistic. So we've definitely talked a lot about this idea of just making sure that you're being understandable, that the arguments that you're selecting are understandable. But I think on a more specific level, make sure that the arguments that you're picking when it comes to doing your prep or when you're preparing your arguments or preparing your cases, or even if you've done a lot of different prep and you're trying to pick which cases or which arguments to read at certain tournaments, I think that selecting arguments that make sense, so are intuitively understandable, or things that are logical, is definitely really helpful. Also focusing on things that are commonly known. So if it's a topic area that not everybody knows something about, i.e. The most recent LD topic, I had no idea what the law of the sea was before I did the topic, or may have heard about it vaguely, but didn't really know the specifics. But it was really easy for me to develop an understanding of the main or most commonly known arguments, things like military presence in places like the Arctic, or competition with Russia and China, or mining. So these are kind of core areas that a lot of people understand. I wouldn't worry too much about trying to assess whether or not your judge knows those things, because even the things that are most commonly known amongst debaters or amongst people who are very knowledgeable about current events and political issues may still not be known by your judge, and that's totally okay. But it's definitely to your advantage to be picking things that you also understand really well yourself. And then just making it easy for your judge to really grasp what you're saying and pick up what you're putting down. I think on that note, it's definitely helpful to avoid controversial or hot button topics. So before I say that, I guess as a disclaimer, I don't think that you should have to avoid talking about certain arguments or avoid certain areas of literature that are equally as important and valid as others just because you're worried that judges may not like them. Definitely don't do that, and don't feel like you have to police yourself too much when it comes to this. I think this is just a general thing to keep in mind when you're doing prep or doing research. If you know that you're researching a specific argument piece where there are a lot of areas of clash that are really contentious right now, or you know that these are things that are really big deals right now. So PF in August had a topic on immigration and border security. So that's an issue that a lot of people have very specific ideas on. So while it's important that people who are debating that topic didn't, avoid talking about certain issues just to avoid upsetting a judge, it's also important that they just made sure that they're conveying those things in a way that isn't really sparking any sort of polarization or any sort of sentiment towards a certain thing from your judge. So just be aware of that. Again, don't feel like you have to cut certain things out or or regulate yourself or like censor yourself when it comes to that, but just knowing the different perspectives on issues before you pick it and doing your best to pick issues that most people can agree on or things that people can at least sort of shift their views on easily. Or something that you know isn't like a really, really currently controversial topic or something that people have a really, really cemented idea of, is definitely to your advantage and just something to keep in mind, especially as a lot of issues definitely tend to have more polarizing sides nowadays, where people will have one idea and somebody else will have another idea. Obviously, you can't make everybody happy, but just avoiding the areas that you know are more likely to be contentious than others. Lastly, here, I would say just making really clear and digestible responses to opponents' arguments and your own arguments. So just making sure that the way that you convey information in the round is really straightforward and you're not spending too much time explaining really, really complex ideas. So if you have a really great turn that you cut to some argument and you know that you love going for this turn every round and it's a really great turn, but it's going to take a lot of time to explain like the specific steps of the link chain, or it's going to take a lot of time to explain the specific terms behind it, or it's going to take a lot of time to explain how that turns your opponent's argument. It may be better to not waste your time having to dive into those things for a lay round rather than just picking a bunch of simple arguments or really simple turns like we'll turn the argument about mining because mining is actually really bad for the environment. So things like that that are just very straightforward and you know that you don't have to spend a lot of time really getting to the nitty-gritty of will definitely help you a lot when it comes to argumentation. On that note, so again, this kind of ties into what we just talked about, but I think stock arguments are typically the most mainstream when it comes to lay debate, for good reason. I think that the most commonly read positions or arguments on both sides are definitely the ones that judges either will have a really better understanding of or feel more comfortable voting for, whether that's because these things are most reflected in literature, in news, media, things like that, or just because it's easy for them to understand what it is, even if they don't have prior background knowledge. It can be to your advantage to pick things that have a plethora of evidence behind them or a lot of authors that are supporting them, things like that. Really just valid, solidified, and like repeatable arguments. So I think that can definitely be helpful. And those are the ones that are often the most likely to be credible. You'll hear people say a lot, like if there's a really niche argument or something that you don't have prep to, chances are a lot of the time that it might be a dumb argument. That's not always true. Definitely do what you want, like prep unique positions if you'd like to. But a lot of the time, a lot of the ones that you can't really find very good evidence for, or you can't really find a lot of people talking about, might be arguments that are less reliable or less solid when it comes to their validity. Especially in lay rounds, it's really important that you're picking arguments that are the most, I guess, valid or solid in that way. So again, something that people worry about, just kind of the flip side of things, is that people have a lot of really good prep to these things. So I think while that's true and the most common arguments people will have a lot of responses to, if you get really good at defending those arguments and you really know your stuff and spend a lot of time having those same rounds where people are frequently reading the same kinds of responses, it'll actually work a lot more to your advantage than having a really unique or niche argument that's less understood, where you're like, haha, my opponent doesn't have prep to this. I think that that's actually probably more harmful to you than it is to just, have something that's more common, but you can explain it really well and like people may have responses to it, but you can still defend it well, than having to fight the uphill battle of like really, really, really breaking down some really, really, really specific part of a topic that your judge probably won't get, your opponent probably won't get, and maybe you don't even fully get. So just keeping that in mind is really helpful. Again, this kind of ties back into the idea of just how you convey your information. But even when you do choose to take a more complex approach to something, or even if you know that you're picking the most stock or common or really understandable arguments, if you know that there are things within those arguments that are going to be more complex, or things that no matter what you do are just more complex in nature, i.e., having to explain like the specific provisions of a treaty or what it means to, I guess, do something or like pass a certain policy, things like that. If you just know that it's an area that it's not common knowledge, not everybody will be able to figure it out, you should definitely be thinking about how to break it down and simplify it as best as possible. So even if it's something that may seem logical to you after you've done some prep and after you understand the topic, your judge may not really get it in the same way that you do, given that they haven't spent the same time arguing for the topic or just breaking it down and prepping it. So just really thinking about how to convey those ins and outs of a topic, which are usually in areas that they may not understand, is definitely really important. And it's really important sure that you're presenting information in ways that I would say, A, just really break down, again, like I said previously, arguments to what they are at their core. So rather than explaining, just like stating something really blatantly, or like really not digging into those warrants, or stating an argument that you know that they probably don't know what it is, or an area that's less commonly known, just saying it and leaving it at that is not going to help you a lot. But taking that argument and breaking it down to what it really is at its core and what it really truly means is definitely a lot more helpful than just focusing on like spewing some kind of argument. So I don't know what the best example would be, but if you're taking an issue that, or an area that, like, let's say mining, you may not know everything about, like, your judge or the people in the room may not know everything about specific kinds of rare earth minerals. They may not know everything about specific kinds of mining techniques. They may not know the specific ways that companies have to go about acquiring permits to be able to mine. So while that's not commonly available information and not things that you can just expect your judges to know, those are things that you can definitely explain in ways that are commonly understood. So if I want to tell my judge about certain kinds of rare earth minerals and why they're important, if I really break that down to just like, there are really important minerals at the bottom of the sea and we can get them by mining. That's a lot more understandable than saying that this specific zone has like this many tons of cobalt and magnesium and things like that. So just taking those really more complex ideas and breaking them down into just what they really truly mean for what they are is definitely really helpful to you. Or explaining that the way that companies can begin mining is if they purchase permits from the specific part of the UNCLOS treaty is definitely a lot more digestible than going into some in-depth explanation of which countries have which permits and things like that. So those are kind of just like floating ideas, but just making sure that you're really pinpointing what they actually mean and explaining it in a way that makes sense to everybody is definitely to your advantage. And then also just being able to navigate any preconceived ideas that your judges may already have. So on topics that are more popular, or on more like commonly understood or mainstream kind of topics or policy areas, some of your judges may have a certain understanding of things and know things are a certain way, and then use that to kind of skirt like listening to what you're actually talking about. So, for example, I had a round where we were reading an argument about cooperation with Russia and the US in the Arctic. And this was on an old PF topic, I think about a year and a half ago, on American military presence in the Arctic. And our argument was saying that Russia and the US are cooperating right now in the Arctic and that it's been really good at diffusing tensions. And then our opponents would say, like, no, Russia's really aggressive. They invaded Ukraine. Like, they're not cooperating with anybody. And our judge's RFD was, well, I read the news and I think Russia's really aggressive. And I think that Russia's not a very cooperative country. So I'm not sure why your argument about Russia being cooperative would be true. So that's an example of something where the judge sort of just had a specific idea or something mainstream or something that they'd heard or something that they believe, and they use that to make their decision rather than using the facts that you're presenting them. So even while it may be true, and also by the judge's understanding, is definitely true that Russia is being aggressive in other areas of the world, that doesn't necessarily make it false that Russia is cooperating with the US in the Arctic, like our argument said. So while that's not the biggest deal, it happens. In lay rounds, you want to make sure that you're not leaving any leeway for your judge to be able to do that. So make sure that you kind of preempt those things. Make sure that you address the different areas that you know judges might be skeptical about. Make sure you're covering the areas that judges kind of already have formulated ideas on. And make sure that, again, you're really just delivering your things confidently and factually and making sure that your judge knows, like, it's not a hypothetical that the US and Russia are cooperating in the Arctic. Like, they are most definitely cooperating. Here's how, here's when, here's why, and here's what our evidence says. So just using those things and conveying those arguments that you may know a lot about, but your judge may not know a lot about, to kind of navigate the arguments that they may be holding to be true already themselves. And then a lot of these things are just kind of broader ideas that I'll touch a little bit on. I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of audience appeals. I think a lot of people are familiar with this from English classes and things like that, but just the concept of ethos, pathos, and logos. I think each of these are individually definitely really helpful for lay debate, and I want to give you them just to kind of think about something or have something to think about and reflect on when you think about going about doing lay debate. So these just relate to the ways that you're able to persuade your audience, with ethos focusing on establishing credibility and building a sense of authority. So how are you as a speaker and how are you as somebody who who's arguing for certain things, giving yourself authority, or how are you creating a sense of authority for yourself by drawing on different prominent figures that are really well known. So this might mean using evidence that's reputable or drawing on values that people widely accept. So leveraging different concepts or values that like a lot of people agree on. So ethos just kind of focuses on building that authority. I think pathos is also really important, especially in lay rounds, which is just the more emotional aspect of things. So when you deliver your arguments, invoking certain emotions out of things can be helpful to you, can also hurt you if you're doing it in a negative manner. But for example, if you attach a really clear impact to an argument and you've convinced your judge that if they don't vote for you, like XYZ conflict will happen, and then this many people will die from it. There, you've created like an emotional connection, or giving your judge some sort of sense of like emotional understanding of a topic, and understand that, okay, the stakes are really high here and the consequences are really large if a conflict does happen because blah, 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 blah. So, again, like I wouldn't do these things like disingenuously. Like, obviously, don't just throw out big numbers or, say really dramatic things to win your judge over. But just using those things and making sure that you're explaining what you're saying really clearly, but also just like making sure that you have some sort of a human connection with your judge, like in the round and how you interact, but also on a purely argumentative level that your judge just kind of can grasp onto that in a more emotional sense is definitely super helpful. And then logos is just focused on logic and like the pure facts of things. So this is also something that you should definitely maintain in lay debate. Again, I mentioned this before, but a lot of people think that lay debate can be an excuse to forgo any sort of like logic, evidence, specific like ideas, or not specific ideas, specific like facts and things like that, and kind of use it as a chance to just say whatever you want and be all willy-nilly because nobody's going to fact check you, and lay judges don't know what they're talking about or things like that. You definitely don't want to do that. I think that's why just keeping in your head that you should have a balance of all three of these things. So having that same authority and emotional connection and emotional appeal, but then also just making sure that you're really maintaining those facts is really important, and just thinking of all three as something that works together and something that you can use as like a trichotomy throughout the round. Like you want to maintain all of those things will definitely help you when you think about just being an effective communicator. And then diving a little bit into narrative and rhetoric, this focuses a little bit more on the first aspect of things, I would say, or the first two, so ethos and pathos. So I think just the idea of narrative is that you're creating a sort of story around your arguments or your cases, and sort of advocating for a specific thing or a specific case, or taking your arguments and wrapping them in a story or an idea that is like appealing to your judge and also understandable to your judge, or maybe emotionally like appealing to your judge. So just using like more commonplace like ideas and things like that to tie them into your arguments, or just building a really great picture of why they should be voting for you. A lot of people talk about this in terms of like big picture analysis, which I think is really important. So just taking a step back from like the specific arguments that you've read in the round and making a really clear case for why it's much better to be in the affirmative world. And here's why. And then telling them a really great story about why the affirmative world is one where if the US signs these specific treaties, we'll have a really peaceful and stable international order, and we'll be able to take on a lot of great new initiatives that will fix a lot of these really complex challenges, or a lot of these big issues like climate change. Like if we do mining, then we're able to get access to specific things for green technology. So things like that, just taking like your arguments and wrapping them in a nice big story for your judge and putting it forth and saying like, look, this is the best world. Like this is what you want to vote for. And this is the place that you want to be. Like, here's why I'm right. And here's why, like, this is the best side, is definitely to your advantage. And just using all the like more conversational elements and more sort of storytelling elements that you can to take a step back from like just really pure debate, and giving that overarching theme as to why your side is the better side is definitely super helpful for you. Also, when it comes to rhetoric, I think the term rhetoric and just thinking about what rhetoric means is just, again, like what's the more image-based side of things that you're putting forth, or what's kind of like the sentiment behind what you're saying, not just specifically what you are saying. So something that's rhetorically sound is not just factually correct. Sometimes it's not factually correct, but something that's rhetorically sound is something that your judge can hear and resonate with in a way that they know that, okay, this sounds accurate, this sounds credible, or this sounds like it builds off of things that I care a lot about. So if I'm reading some sort of argument that relates to democracy and I've convinced my judge that my side is the best for upholding democratic values, then that's an example of me having persuasive rhetoric that sort of uses elements of things that judges may value or people may value, and are convincing in a way that just takes a step back from pure debate and kind of focuses more on why something matters and I guess just what my delivery of something is and how I can make it most effective to you is definitely super important. Just making sure that you're maintaining those elements and having them sort of at the forefront of your debate rather than focusing just on purely argumentation and saying like, they conceded this piece of evidence and we win this and our impact that way. So instead of just doing that, tying that all together to say like, they've conceded these arguments, and here's what these arguments mean. Here's why you should feel comfortable voting for these arguments. Here's the broader conceptual ideas of these arguments. Here's why voting affirmative matters to uphold or achieve some broader sense of something. So, a useful tool for narrative and rhetoric when it comes to LD specifically can definitely be your framework. So, in a lot of lay and traditional rounds, there will be a lot more of an emphasis on traditional frameworks and things like that. So, if you're advocating for mitigating structural violence. If you can explain really nicely why passing this policy will be really effective at mitigating structural violence and reducing the oppression that certain groups have to endure, and you're really putting forth a cohesive and digestible and persuasive, and also utilizing those audience appeals like connect emotionally and resonates with your judge, you're just putting a story together that does and combines all of those elements. You're putting yourself in a lot better of a position if you just stood up and you were like, well, we win XYZ argument, and that links into our framing about mitigating structural oppression, so you should vote for me, and we beat them on whatever argument. So just making sure that you're really taking a step back and looking at things from just a broader storytelling level can really, really help. Okay, so we'll be getting into kind of the end of things and just wrapping it up a little bit. I'm not going to dive too much in depth here in this section especially, and we'll just kind of take a couple concepts to talk about because preparation can be very event specific and can also vary based on your personal preference. But I think just in terms of preparing for lay debates, some of the best practices that I think you can have. So we talked a little bit about argumentation already, but I think it's just really important when you sit down to do prep for a topic that you're thinking really strategically and thinking back to a lot of the things that we talked about in the argumentation section, and just thinking back to selecting arguments that are well reflected in the literature, selecting arguments that reputable authors and sources are putting out and are agreeing on and sort of building a consensus on. So looking for those areas where there are consensus is really helpful rather than diving into some really niche blog or corner of the internet where they all agree that nuclear war will happen if we do something, 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 and everybody will die. That's a lot less reliable and a lot less strategic for a lay round than looking to a really well-known source or many different sources that all agree that if the US passes XYZ policy, we'll be able to create some new program or we'll be able to mitigate the risk of conflict, things like that. So a lot of those arguments that are less far-fetched are also definitely super helpful to you and to your advantage. And typically those will be the arguments that are most commonly known on the topic or most commonly reflected while you're doing your research. So keeping an eye out for those things and evaluating the sources that you're finding critically and making sure that you're not looking at things that are really, really niche. And obviously you can't find more than one piece of evidence saying that we're going to go to war tomorrow, then maybe it's not true that we're going to go to war tomorrow. And maybe that's not an argument that you should be prioritizing, or maybe that's not an argument that you should go down the avenue of researching. So definitely just keeping those things in mind can be super helpful when it comes to picking arguments strategically and just thinking back to some of those things, especially about looking at, I guess, also where sources are coming from. Is this an evidence or like an author or a source that has certain political leanings or certain affiliations that may harm their credibility? Just really thinking about those things can be really helpful to you. One note on authors, which I'll skip to this section really quickly, just evidence in general. When it comes to using reliable sources, I think a lot of people learn this just as like little life skills, but especially with debate, it's definitely really important. You want to avoid sources that I guess you could find easily to be known for, or maybe you just know yourself are known for something really controversial or are known for having a very cemented view on something. While that's not inherently bad, and I'm not discouraging the use of certain kinds of pieces of evidence and things like that, it's definitely to your advantage as a debater to think like, okay, how might my judge perceive this? You know, what might my judge think about this? And how can it help me to use certain sources that are neutral and things like that? So, for example, on the again recent LD topic with the UNCLOS Treaty and the ICC, the Heritage Foundation, which is like a think tank, wrote a lot of different papers and articles and things as to why UNCLOS and the ICC were bad treaties or bad policies to join. And while again, it's like not inherently harmful that the Heritage Foundation is like a more conservative or right-leaning organization, what does hinder you if you're reading that evidence as a debater is that the Heritage Foundation, like with a quick Google search, you could find out was really involved in lobbying against UNCLOS passing in Congress, or like lobbying against senators signing like a bill to get UNCLOS ratified at the time where it was an issue, or like at the time where it was a topic being like discussed in Congress in the United States. So that's obviously pretty bad for your credibility if you as a debater are standing up and saying, here's this piece of evidence and here's this source saying firmly why we should not join this treaty. And then your opponent is like, well, this source was actually really known for lobbying and hindering a lot of efforts to pass the treaty, so that's not really reliable, or, that's obviously a biased source. That's going to hurt you more than it'll help you. So just kind of making sure that you're not picking biased sources or sources that may have some involvement in the topic that wouldn't be to your benefit. And then also just making sure you're picking reliable sources. So reputable news organizations, research papers. I'm a huge advocate for papers. Really like good authors and like scholarly studies and things will be a lot better than just random articles always. I think empirical evidence is also super duper helpful when it comes to lay debate, because empirical evidence and just having things that are based or rooted in like historical ideas or rooted in like rigorous confirmed studies rather than things that are just like, floating ideas or theories or hypotheticals will be a lot better than just sort of like prioritizing or focusing on those more like mainstream news articles and things, which of course you can still use and can be super duper helpful. But I always think it's good that whatever arguments you find, if you're able to find them, look for different papers and more like academic or literature-based sources that are valid and can definitely like boost the quality of your argument. So I think going back to just like evidence in general, this is something that's a little like less of a concern, but I think that the way you also do your prep can be really important. So just cutting evidence and making sure that you're cutting things in a manner that's really clear, less wordy, direct and to the point. Make sure that also you are making like your cards like reflect what the articles say. I think some people think also that lay debate is like a great time to learn how to paraphrase and try to find pieces of evidence and just write up what you think it says rather than actually reflecting what it says. I don't really like personally like the practice of paraphrasing, but also in general, I think that whatever you're doing with your evidence when it comes to lay debate, it's really important that you are making sure that what you are saying is fully reflective of what your evidence is saying. So again, like while it may seem like lay debate is a time to kind of like really simplify things and stuff like that, it's definitely not a time to make things up or misconstrue things that your authors may be saying or push certain arguments forward because you know that, nobody's going to have as like high or rigorous standards as for like the truth or quality of those things. Definitely don't be doing that and do your best to make sure again that you're being honest, factual, and just making sure that your evidence is really direct and clear and reflective of what the evidence itself actually says. So I think that's also just really helpful on a communicative level if you're cutting evidence very directly and clearly, and again, doing things like also writing your taglines in ways that are really simple and to the point is definitely to your advantage and will make your speech and your ways of speaking and communicating a lot clearer and a lot more like to the point, direct and effective, rather than cutting like really long, wordy papers full of jargon or writing really long taglines that reflect your opinion or your argument that you're trying to make, but don't really align with what the card is saying. Definitely be aware of those things. Lastly, I think it's really important to just read your sources very carefully. So know what your sources are saying, and kind of build up the topic knowledge that you think is like, or build up a lot of topic knowledge, regardless of whether or not you're planning on doing a lot of lay debate. I think it's just really important to be well read on topics. And it definitely helps you, especially when it comes to lay debate. Me personally, I'm not necessarily the best at speaking very authoritatively on something when I don't know it too well. So I'll be less comfortable going for an argument that I didn't spend as much time cutting cutting, or I didn't read all of the specific papers in depth for. But then I know that when I do read things more in depth, I feel a lot more confident going for it, a lot more comfortable understanding it and being able to explain it. So that's definitely really helpful in the stages of prep, just really getting yourself in the habit of reading everything you can and really brushing up on things regardless. And regardless of whether or not these are arguments you end up reading, if I have a lot of time or I'm prepping a topic for a really long time, I like to cut like many different arguments on both the AF and the neg side, even if I know that I won't end up reading like 8, 9, or 7, 8 different contentions. I like to go and read about them or, try cutting them for myself and then go back later and choose what arguments I actually want to end up reading. And even if I don't end up reading the other ones, I still have the advantage of now having really read the specific areas of literature of other ones that I know my opponents will be making or things like that. Because I think that definitely helps you when it comes to thinking about how to respond to different arguments. Also, just being able to defend yourself in round. If you have read a lot of papers and really know your topics well, when somebody asks you a question, ideally that's a question that you would have already known the answer to based on the research you've done beforehand and can just answer like that and be able to defend things and like patch holes that your opponent may be trying to poke in your arguments. And I think that that really helps you for lay debate as well, just in terms of appearing more credible. If you don't have to stop and really think about a question and think about how to answer it, you're in a lot better position than if you didn't know anything about the topic. We'll skip case structure and blocks because we kind of touched on that a little bit when it comes to just preparing specific evidence. I want to go over in-round strategy pretty quickly, especially again because it varies event to event, but just talking about big ideas. In your constructive and case speeches, a lot of this is really just rooted in the stage of prep, which we already kind of dove into, but just making sure that the way that you read your case and the way that you write your case and prepare your cases are reflective, again, of like commonly understandable or just really simplistic or at least delivered in a way that's understandable arguments. So even if you do choose to read more complex arguments, just making sure that the evidence that you're cutting, the words that you're using, and the way that you're explaining things is really just digestible and understandable to everybody. And then I think the second thing is just really making sure that the way that your case flows is something that you can read really naturally and confidently. So again, this may look like avoiding really big academic words or really complex things that would take too much time to explain, or that your judge would hear and be like, I don't know what that means. And now they're a little confused for the rest of your speech. So just making sure you're avoiding those things and using language or using like a really good, like kind of structure that just flows really nicely together. And it sounds like you're speaking more naturally rather than something that's choppy or confusing is definitely super helpful to you. I think also just making sure that you're reading case very slowly. So when you're cutting your cases, time them multiple times, like practice reading like maybe a lengthier version if you think that, you're packing too many cards in there. Even if that's something that you'd read in a regular round where you can speak at a regular speed, it's a good practice to try and take out pieces of evidence or shorten like how much you're reading and make sure that you're delivering it in a realistic pace and also something that like you can make it through it in within the time constraints, but also slowly enough that your judge is following within those time constraints as well. Just for rebuttals and then back half speeches, we'll do them both together. When it comes to just like your speeches and your in-round strategy, I think we talked a little bit about this when it comes to just like the kinds of responses that you want to be making and making sure, again, that you're doing things that are very straightforward and clear cut and not really using like complex terms or complex ideas or strategies or things that you think would work really well, if you have a judge that's very rigorously flowing, but things that probably won't work very well if your judge is just sitting there listening to you, likely not flowing, or maybe flowing, but in a less comprehensive or rigorous way. It's definitely important that you're just aware of that as you deliver your speeches. I think when it comes to rebuttals specifically, you want to make sure that you're interacting directly with the arguments that your opponents are making. So, while you might have a lot of really like basic blocks or responses to some common argument that your opponent might be running, just still making sure that you're looking at the specific warrants that your opponent reads, the specific way that they deliver the arguments, make sure that you're listening and following them closely, and then making sure that your rebuttal is actually adaptive off of what your opponent is saying, and not just standing up and reading something like staring at your computer and reading like 4 minutes of blocks. I think that that's a lot more persuasive to your judges if it's clear that you're able to think on your feet and communicate things without just staring at a computer. And B, it's also just more advantageous to you to be able to poke specific holes in your opponent's arguments and latch onto things that like you catch areas where you think your opponent, isn't making sense, or areas where your opponent isn't explaining something fully. And then point pointing out those things and getting your judge to catch on to them too is super helpful. So just really thinking about how you can like poke different holes in your opponent's arguments and also patch up holes in your own arguments effectively and make sure that, again, you know your case really well and can go back and defend it and things. And then in terms of your back half speeches, just making sure that you're really summarizing everything and boiling it down in a nice way that your judges and your opponents can really understand everything super effectively. It's definitely really helpful. And you should definitely focus on that sort of big picture crystallization idea that we talked a little bit about. So just kind of tying it in or bringing it all back down to the end. If there's the last slide. Okay, I guess there is no conclusion slide. I had something written down, but that's okay. We'll just spend a couple minutes just recapping everything. So at the end of the day, lay debate is definitely something that can be super fun, a little tedious if you're not the biggest fan of lay debate already, but I think that it's definitely an acquired taste. The more you do of it, the more you'll get to enjoy it and really get more experience in it and just more background in it. And it'll make it something that's a bit more bearable to do if you're somebody who doesn't like it. If you're like me, I've always kind of really liked lay debate right away. I think it's super fun and definitely something that can be a breath of fresh air, especially if you compete more regularly on the national circuit. Just getting slower, more moderate rounds can definitely be really helpful to your skills and also just really enjoyable for yourself. So I think that it's just really important to kind of keep in mind a lot of those big ideas that we talked about when it comes to how you present yourself and the different arguments you're making and things like that. The only other thing that I wanted to address here is that there are some challenges and difficulties when it comes to lay debate. I think that a lot of the time people think of lay debate and think of rounds where they've been screwed or rounds where what they would call the decision a screw or say that it was an unfair decision or something like that. And while those are definitely more common in lay rounds just because your judges are not necessarily debate experts, it's definitely really important that you like go into each lay round with a positive attitude and, willing to come and debate and learn and have fun in that round. But definitely don't expect your lay judges to be able to make the same quality of the decision as somebody who's super experienced might be able to. So I think that's really helpful for debaters themselves to just like have realistic expectations, like don't go into the round thinking you can do whatever you want and say whatever you want and your judge is so good and flowing so well that they'll catch everything because oftentimes they're not and you can't really put that same standard towards your lay judges. So I think just make sure that you're navigating that and make sure that you understand that your judges are not necessarily going to always produce the decisions that you'd like. But that's why lay debate is something that you really have to practice and cultivate and learn how to adapt to them more so than they have to adapt to you. Whereas other styles of debate, you may kind of have that expectation of your judge to adapt to you more so. So I think that those are kind of just the biggest things. There are definitely other challenges that you may come across in lay debate. I think that's something that I've also kind of noticed is that lay judges, again, as they're likely to make decisions that may be less rigorous or less rooted in what actually happened in the round. I think that the issue of bias can also come up a lot in lay rounds. So whether that's for different racial minorities or gender minorities as well, which we talk a lot about when it comes to like women in debates, like advocacy as well. Like I think it's very common that gender minorities and female presenting debaters can have a lot harder of a time like engaging in lay rounds because a lot of judges will that's a space where or I guess a form of debate where judges kind of invite more biases into the space to make their decision and will decide that they like the way somebody talks or they don't like the way somebody talks or they like how so and so presents themselves but they don't like how so and so presents themselves. So those are definitely challenges that do come up, obviously not just in lay debate but very commonly in lay debate. So it's good to be aware of that also and don't feel like you have to attach your ability as a debater to the decisions that you may not agree with that judges produce or the decisions that may just be flat out biased that lay judges can sometimes produce. All judges, obviously, but very commonly lay judges as well. So again, just being aware of those dynamics and not worrying about it too much, but just going out and having fun. I think that lay debate can be really fun, and it's really what you make of it. You can make it really boring and grudge work if you want to, or you can make it something enjoyable and just a great way to practice your skills. I think it's just really what you look at it as and what you take it as. But it's definitely something that I really enjoy, and I hope you all do too. So that kind of concludes things. Thank you guys so much for coming. If you ever have any questions, you can reach out to me in the WIN Slack. My name, Brooke Gemechu, very easy to find, and I'm definitely happy to answer any questions relating to lay debate. If you ever want to talk about also navigating some more of those difficulties, I've definitely dealt with that a lot myself, and I'm always happy to talk about that and just helping you sort of build the resources and tools necessary to work around those things. But yeah, that's pretty much everything. There's one question I see, so I'll answer that really quickly, and then you guys are good to go. But on collapsing. Okay, so I think that's a really great thing to mention. I definitely think that I would have loved to dig more into this if we also looked event by event. But yeah, so I do LD, so I think that when it comes to the 1 AR, I think the 1 AR is really hard. Obviously, it's a big time crunch, so you really only have 4 minutes to do a lot of work that should be as flawless as it can be to set yourself up really well for the 2 AR. So it's definitely a big challenge. I would say that collapsing in late debate is very strategic. It just can seem unstrategic because like people have had rounds where judges will be like, oh, like you didn't talk about XYZ argument, so I'm not voting for you, or you lost that argument. So I think some people have experiences like that, or you'll just be scared that like it looks worse to not go for everything. But I think actually collapsing is just as important, if not more, in lay rounds because it gives you more time to really go in depth or explain the specific areas that you want to actually go for. And you can do a lot more like in-depth analysis of a specific area rather than spreading yourself really thin, especially because you have to talk a lot more slowly and break things down a lot more. So I would definitely say that collapsing is a really great idea, but it depends on how you do it so that you can avoid those judges who are like, why didn't you talk about every argument? The first thing I would say is that if you are in a round where it's viable to go for both arguments, again, also since lay debate is a lot slower and less content heavy, there will not be many times where like you're so stretched that it'd be impossible to go over both arguments, but there are times where your opponent may have put a lot more on one argument than the other. So again, just like assess it round by round. But if it's viable to go for both comfortably, I would, or as many arguments as you're reading, I would just go for what you can. But if it's less viable, or if you just think it wouldn't be particularly strategic for you to have to try to explain one argument, then just collapse. And I think when it comes to collapsing, when you know you've decided like this is a good round to collapse in, or you've decided like I can't go for everything in this round, like I literally can't time-wise, make sure that you make it really clear that what you're doing is collapsing without just being like, oh, we'll go for this, or oh, we're collapsing on this. I think a lot of judges now understand what it means. Really newer judges might not, but judges who are lay judges but kind of have some background, like usually know what you're doing. But just saying something like, well, both of our arguments are really great in today's round, or while both contentions about blah, 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 blah are really important, we'll focus specifically on the first contention. Or in the rest of this debate, like I'll specifically be going for, or I'll specifically be talking about this contention. So just making it really clear that you're picking one, choosing one, and then sticking with that for the rest of the round, and then leveraging that like later in the round, like in the 2 AR and things like that, is definitely really important and definitely to your advantage. Just make sure it's super clear. Then really quickly on the second part of the question with timing on the 1 AR, I think it definitely depends, but I think that it definitely depends on what you're personally comfortable with and also like what you're used to. My personal preference for 1 AR timing, and I think also just what is really good for lay rounds, is I'll try and spend about a minute 30 maybe on the AF and then probably 2:30 on the neg. I think it depends round to round. If it's a round where I think like I want to do more in-depth analysis on the AF, I'll spend 2 minutes on the AF, 2 minutes on the neg. Or if it's a round where there's a lot of framework, like framing stuff, I'll do a minute on both frameworks together and then like a minute and a half on each side. So it definitely depends again, like on the kind of round that you're having. But if yeah, I would also just like look specifically at what's on each side of the flow. So if you know that there's very minimal content on the affirmative and it's really easy for you to go for it and defend it very quickly, then just do that quickly, get it out of the way, and then spend more time taking apart the negative. But if it's the other way around and you know there's a lot more to handle on the negative, but there's a lot more to handle on the affirmative side and a lot less on the negative, then just kind of adapt and tailor your strategy to that. But the best thing you can do for yourself in the 1 AR is always start with the affirmative, and just make sure that you get the affirmative like fully explain and defend what you're going for. That way, no matter what your opponent does in their speeches, no matter what your opponent goes for, you still have offense or like really solid ground that you can leverage and go off of. Especially in lay rounds, that's super important that your judge just knows you have a really solidified argument or position that you can go for really comfortably and explain really well. And the best way to do that is set yourself up well in the 1 AR itself, and make sure that you are doing the work that you need to do to get the affirmative like as protected as you can, and then worry about the neg after, if that makes sense. I hope that answers it. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to throw them out. We obviously don't want to keep you guys too long, but if again anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Slack. I am also, you can reach out to me via my email if you have any specific questions or prep matters that you want to talk about. My email is just my name, brookegemechu@gmail.com, but instead of Brooke, it's Brookie, so IE. But yeah, if you guys have anything that you want to ever hear more about in depth, I'm really happy to talk about any of that or just break down more specific concepts. And thank you so much for coming and listening and watching, and I hope you all learned something. Okay.
Thank
Any
you.
questions? Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.
Of course. I'll stop the screen share.